7. The Renaissance outside Italy. Outside Italy, people were much less conscious of any sudden break with the Middle Ages. Developments north of the Alps and in Spain were more an outgrowth of what had gone before. There was indeed a cultural renaissance in the Italian sense, and some Flemish masters introduced artistic innovations even before the new techniques were used by 74 painters in Italy. In the north, also as in Italy, writers favored a revival of classical Latin, but the modern written languages also began to develop. The Northern Renaissance resembled the earlier Southern Renaissance in blending the old and the new, but the religious element was much stronger than in Italy. The most important Northern humanists were writers such as Thomas More in England and Erasmus in Holland. The French humanism that produced the earthy Francois Rabelais also produced the austere John Calvin. Religious scholarship and science, 1 in 78 historians like to distinguish between the pagan humanism of Italy and the Christian humanism of the North. In the North, Christian humanists studied the Hebrew and Greek texts of the Bible and read the Church Fathers, both Latin and Greek, in order to deepen their understanding of Christianity and to restore its moral vitality. Among people without pretense to humanistic learning, religion also remained a force. Medieval intellectual interests persisted. This is apparent from the continuing foundation of universities. The humanists generally regarded universities as centers of a pedantic, monkish, and scholastic learning. Concentrating upon theology or upon medicine and law, the universities gave little encouragement to experimental science and still less to purely literary studies. In Italy in the 15th century, no new universities were established, but in Spain, in France, in Scotland, in Scandinavia, and above all in Germany, new universities continued to develop. Between 1386 and 1506, no less than 14 universities were established in Germany. At one of the newest, Wittenberg, founded in 1502, Martin Luther was to launch the Protestant Reformation. Christian humanists' Germany at this time, on the eve of the great religious upheaval and before the shift of the principal commercial arteries from Central Europe to the Atlantic seaboard, was a main center of European life. Politically, the German-speaking world was an ill-defined and ill-organized region, composed of many diverse parts, from which the Netherlands and Switzerland were not yet differentiated. Economically, nevertheless, Western and Southern Germany enjoyed a lead over most of Western Europe. The towns traded busily, and German banking families, like the famous Fugger, controlled more capital than any others in Europe. Technical inventiveness was alive, mining was developing, and it was in the Rhineland at Mainz that Gutenberg, about 1450, produced the first European books printed with movable type. In painting, the western 179 fringe of the Germanic world produced the Flemish masters, and South Germany gave birth to imaginative artists such as Albrecht Dürer and the Holbeins. Intellectually, Germany shared in the Latin culture of Europe, a fact often obscured by the Latin names that German authors used in the early modern era. Regiomontanus, the Latin name of Johann Miller, laid the foundations during his short lifetime, 1436 to 1476, for a mathematical conception of the universe. He was probably the most influential scientific worker of the 15th century, especially since Leonardo da Vinci's scientific labors remained unknown. Nicholas of Cusa, 1401 to 1464, a Rhinelander, was a churchman whose mystical philosophy entered into the later development of mathematics and science. From such a background of mathematical interests came Copernicus, Nicholas Copernic, 1473 to 1543, who believed that the Earth moved about the sun. He was indeed a Pole, but he came from the mixed German-Polish region of East Prussia. Fortified by the same mathematical interests, Europe's best-known cartographers were also Germans, such as Behem and Schoner, whose world maps represented the most advanced geographical knowledge of the time. Paracelsus, Latin for 75 Hohenheim, undertook to revolutionize medicine at the University of Basel. His wild prophecies made him a mixture of scientist and charlatan, but, in truth, science was not yet clearly distinguished from the occult, with which it shared the idea of control over natural forces. A similar figure, remembered in literature and the arts, was the celebrated Dr. Faustus. In real life, Faust, or Faustus, was perhaps a learned German of the first part of the 16th century. He was rumored to have sold his soul to the devil in return for knowledge and power. The Faust story was dramatized in England as early as 1593 by Christopher Marlowe, and much later by Goethe in German poetry. In the legend of Faust, later generations were to see a symbol of the inordinate ambitions of modern people. German contributions to early modern science, 180, the idea that human powers could understand and control physical nature developed especially north of the Alps, but this idea also corresponded in many ways to the more purely Italian and humanistic emphasis on the infinite richness of human personalities. Together, these ideas constituted the new Renaissance spirit, for both stressed the emancipation of humanity's limitless potentialities. The two ideas constantly interacted. In fact, most of the scientific workers just mentioned, Regiomontanus, Nicholas of Cusa, Copernicus, spent many years in Italy, receiving the stimulus of Italian thought. Mysticism and lay religion. In the North, a genuine religious impulse went beyond the religious humanistic scholarship and sustained a stronger interest in Christian mysticism. Where in Italy the religious sense, if not extinct, seemed to pass into a joyous and public cult in which God was glorified by works of art, in the North it took on a more spiritual and moral tone. Germany in the 14th century produced a series of mystics. The mystic tendencies of Nicholas of Cusa have been mentioned. More typical mystics were Meister Eckhart, d. 1327, and Thomas à Kempis, d. 1471, author of The Imitation of Christ. The essence of mysticism lay in the belief or experience that the individual soul could, in perfect solitude, commune directly with God. The mystic had no need of reason, nor of words, nor of joining with other people in open worship, nor of the sacraments administered by the priests, nor even of the church. The mystics did not rebel against the church. They accepted its pattern of salvation. But they also offered, to those who could follow, a deeper religious experience in which the church as a social institution had no place. All social institutions, in fact, were transcended in mysticism by the individual soul. And on this doctrine, both profound and socially disruptive, Martin Luther was later to draw. Mysticism and the individual soul, 181. For the church, it was significant also that religion was felt deeply outside the clergy. Persons stirred by religion, who in the Middle Ages would have taken holy orders, now frequently remained laymen. In the past, the church had often needed reform. But in the past, the clergy had found influential reformers within their own ranks. The church had thus been repeatedly reformed and renewed without revolution. Now, in the 15th and early 16th centuries, an ominous line seemed to be increasingly drawn between the clergy as an established interest, inert and set in its ways, merely living and living well off the church, and groups of people outside the clergy, religious laypersons, religiously inclined humanists and writers, impatient and headstrong rulers, who were more influential than ever before and more critical of ecclesiastical abuses. Lay religion was especially active in the Netherlands. A lay preacher, Gerard Gruty, attracted followers there by calling for spiritual regeneration. In 1374, he founded a religious sisterhood, which was followed by establishments for religiously minded men. They called themselves, respectively, the Sisters and the Brothers of the Common Life, and they eventually received papal approval. They lived communally, but not as monks, 76 and nuns, for they took no vows, wore ordinary clothing, and were free to leave at will. They worked at relieving the poor and in teaching. The schools of the brothers, since some of them came to have as many as 1,000 boys, were the first to be organized in separate classes, each with its own room and its own teacher, according to the pupil's age or level of advancement. The sisters maintained similar, though less elaborate schools for girls. Students learned to read and write, but the emphasis was on a Christian ideal of character and conduct, and the goal was to instill such qualities as humility, tolerance, reverence, love of one's neighbor, and the conscientious performance of duty. This modern devotion, as it was called, spread widely in the Netherlands and adjoining parts of Germany. 182, the Sisters and Brothers of the Common Life, Erasmus of Rotterdam. In this atmosphere grew up the greatest of all the northern humanists, and indeed the most notable figure of the entire humanist movement, Erasmus of Rotterdam, 1466 to 1536. Like all the humanists, Erasmus chose to write in a purified and usually intricate Latin style. He regarded the Middle Ages as benighted, ridiculed the scholastic philosophers, and studied deeply the classical writers of antiquity. He had the strength and the limitations of the pure man of letters. To the hard questions of serious philosophy, he was largely indifferent. He feared the unenlightened excitability of the common people, and he was almost wholly unpolitical in his outlook. He rarely thought in terms of worldly power or advantage and made too little allowance for those who did. An exact contemporary to the most worldly Renaissance popes, Erasmus was keenly aware of the need for reform of the clergy. He put his faith in education, enlightened discussion, and gradual moral improvement, and he counseled against all violence or fanaticism. He prepared new Greek and Latin editions of the New Testament. Urging people to read the New Testament in the vernacular languages, he 77 hoped that a better understanding of Christ's teaching might turn them from their evil ways. In his praise of folly, he satirized all worldly pretensions and ambitions, those of the clergy most emphatically. In his Handbook of a Christian Knight, he showed how a man might take part in the affairs of the world while remaining a devout Christian. Tolerance, restraint, good manners, scholarly understanding, a love of peace, a critical and reforming zeal, and a reasonable tone from which shouting and bad temper were always excluded. Such were the Erasmian virtues. Erasmus of Rotterdam, 1803, Erasmus of Rotterdam by Hans Holbein the Younger, German, 1497 to 1543. This portrait from 1532 portrays the famous humanist toward the end of his lifelong campaigns to promote tolerance and careful scholarship, suggesting perhaps his dismay as Christians divided into bitterly warring factions in the early 16th century. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, Robert Lehman Collection, 1975. Erasmus achieved an international eminence such as no one of purely intellectual attainments had ever enjoyed. He corresponded with the most powerful kings and church officials in Europe. Theologians found fault with Erasmus's ideas, in which indeed the supernatural had little importance, but among the leaders of the church, the popes and prelates, he had many admirers. Erasmus, it must be noted, attacked only the abuses in the church, the ignorance or sloth of the clergy, and the moral or financial corruption of their lives. The essence and principle of the Roman Catholic Church he never called into question. The Erasmian spirit, so widely diffused about 1520, might have helped to reform the church without far reaching social or spiritual upheaval. But the revolutionary impact of Protestantism soon drove Erasmian tolerance and restraint out of Europe's intensely divisive religious debates. 8. The New Monarchies, 184. Meanwhile, in Europe outside Italy, kings were actively building the institutions of the modern state. It was these states, more than any other single factor, that were to determine the course of the 16th century religious revolution. Whether a country turned Protestant, remained Catholic, or divided into separate religious communities would depend very largely upon political considerations. War, civil war, class war, feudal rebellion, and plain banditry afflicted a good deal of Europe in the middle of the 15th century. In this formless violence, central governments had become very weak. Various rulers now tried to impose a more orderly civil peace. They have been conveniently called the new monarchs, but they were not really very new because they resumed the interrupted labors of kings in the High Middle Ages. They thus laid foundations for later national, or at least territorial, states. The new monarchs offered the institution of monarchy as a guarantee of law and order. Arousing latent sentiments of loyalty to the reigning dynasty, they proclaimed that hereditary monarchy was the only legitimate form of public power. They especially enlisted the support of middle class people in the towns, who were tired of the private wars and marauding habits of the feudal nobles. Townspeople were willing to let parliaments be dominated or even ignored by the king, for parliaments had proved too often to be strongholds of unruly barons, or had merely accentuated class conflict. The king, receiving money in taxes, was able to organize armies with which to control the nobles. The use of the pike and the longbow, which enabled the foot soldier to stand against the horseman, was here of great potential value. The king, if only he could get his monarchy sufficiently organized and his finances into reliable order, could hire large numbers of foot soldiers, who generally came from the growing population of commoners, unlike the knightly horsemen. But to organize his monarchy, the king had to break down the mass of feudal, inherited, customary, or common law in which the rights of the feudal classes were entrenched. For this purpose, at least on the continent, the new monarch made use of Roman law, which was now actively studied in 885th the universities. He called himself a sovereign. It was at this time that kings began to be addressed as majesty. The king, said the experts in Roman law, incorporated the will and welfare of the people in his own 78 person. He could therefore make law by his own authority, regardless of previous custom or even of historic liberties. And they quoted Latin phrases to argue that what pleases the prince has the force of law. The new monarchy in England, France, and Spain. The new monarchy came to England with the dynasty of the Tudors, 1485 to 1603, whose first king, Henry VII, 1485 to 1509, after gaining the throne by force, put an end to the civil turbulence of the Wars of the Roses. In these wars, the great English baronial families had seriously weakened each other, to the great convenience of the king and most of the common people. Henry VII passed laws against livery and maintenance, the practice by which great lords maintained private armies wearing their own livery or insignia, and he used his royal council as a new court to deal with property disputes and infractions of the public peace. It met in a room decorated with stars, whence its name, the Star Chamber. It represented the authority of the king and his council, and it operated without a jury. Later denounced as an instrument of despotism, it was popular enough at first because it preserved order and rendered substantial justice. Henry VII, though miserly and unpleasant in person, was accepted as a good ruler. National feeling in England consolidated around the House of Tudor. The Tudors. In France, the new monarchy was represented by Louis V, 1461 to 1483, of the Valois line, and his successors. In the 5 centuries after the first French king was crowned, the royal domain had steadily expanded from its original small nucleus around Paris through a combination of inheritance, marriage, war, intrigue, and conquest. Louis V continued to 186 round out the French borders. Internally, he built up a royal army, suppressed brigands, and subdued rebellious nobles. He acquired far greater powers than the English Tudors to raise taxation without parliamentary consent. The French monarchy also enlarged its already exceptional powers over the clergy. In 1516, King Francis I reached an agreement with Pope Leo X in the Concordat of Bologna, which gave the Pope financial income from the French church, but allowed the French king to appoint the church bishops and abbots within France. The fact that, after 1516, The kings of France already controlled their own national clergy was one reason why, in later years, that they were never tempted to turn Protestant. The Valois, strictly speaking, there was no kingdom of Spain. Various Spanish kingdoms had combined into two, Aragon and Castile. To Aragon, which lay along the Mediterranean side of the peninsula, belonged the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Sicily, and the South Italian kingdom of Naples. To Castile, after 1492, belonged the newly discovered Americas. The two were joined in a personal union by the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469. The union was personal only. That is, both kingdoms recognized the two monarchs, but they had no common political, judicial, or administrative institutions. There was little or no Spanish national feeling. Indeed, the Catalans in northern Aragon spoke a language quite different from Castilian Spanish. The most significant common feeling throughout Spain came from the sense of belonging to the Spanish Catholic Church. The common memory was that of the Christian crusade against the Muslims, Moors, who had long lived on the southern Iberian Peninsula. The one common institution whose officials had equal authority and equal access to all the kingdoms was a church court, the Inquisition. Meanwhile, the Reconquista was at last completed when the southern tip of Spain, Granada, was conquered from the Moors in 1492. Its annexation added to the heterogeneous character of the Spanish dominions. 887, Aragon and Castile 79. In these circumstances, the new monarchy in Spain followed a religious bent. Unification took place around the church. The rulers, though they made efforts at political centralization, worked largely through facilities offered by the church. And the early sense of Spanishness was linked to a sense of Catholicity. Formerly, the Spanish had been among the most tolerant of Europeans. Christians, Muslims, and Jews had managed to live together. But in the wave of religious excitement that accompanied the conquest of Granada, both the Jews and the Moors were expelled. The expulsion of the Jews by a decree of 1492 was actually a sign of former toleration in Spain, for the Jews had been earlier expelled from England in 1290 and from France in 1306. They were not again legally allowed in England until the mid-17th century, nor in France, with some exceptions, until the French Revolution. In Spain, as in the history of many European peoples, the emergence of an early national consciousness seemed to express or produce an anti-Semitism that defined Jews as outsiders. 2. All persons in Spain were now supposed to be Christians. In fact, however, Spain was one of the places in Europe where a person's Christianity could not be taken for granted, because many Spanish families had been Jewish or Muslim for centuries and had only accepted Christianity to avoid expulsion. Hence arose a fear of false Christians, of an unassimilated element secretly hostile to the foundations of Spanish life. It was feared that Moriscos, Christians of Moorish background, and Marranos, Christians of Jewish background, retained a clandestine sympathy for the religion of their forebears. Thousands of such persons were brought before the Inquisition, where, as in the civil courts under Roman procedure, torture could be employed to extort confessions. It was thus safest to be profuse in one's external religious devotions because adherence to the Catholic Church became the way of proving oneself to be a good Spaniard. 188, fusing the national and the Catholic dinner. The life of Spain carried forward some of the long existing commitment to a crusade, which had now evolved into a campaign within Spain against Moriscos and Marranos, and a new campaign against the Moors in northern Africa itself, which the Spanish invaded immediately after the conquest of Granada. The Spanish also extended their religious energies into the Americas, where the Spanish Church set about gathering the Indians into the Christian fold, and Spain's strong religious identity would soon contribute to its growing role in the wider political and religious conflicts of 16th century Europe. The Spanish history of crusades against Muslims had prepared the country, before Protestantism ever appeared, to become a leading defender of Roman Catholic traditions as well as an advocate for Catholic renewal and internal reforms. The Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg supremacy ideas of the new monarchy were at work even in Germany, which is to say, in the Holy Roman Empire. There were three kinds of states in the empire. There were the princely states such as Saxony, Brandenburg, or Bavaria, each of which was a small hereditary dynastic monarchy in itself. There were also ecclesiastical states, bishoprics, abbacies, etc., in which the bishop or abbot, whose rule was of course not hereditary, conducted the government. A large portion of the area of the empire consisted of these church states. Third, there were the imperial free cities, some 50 in number. Their collective area was not large, but they dominated the commercial and financial life of the country. The German states, over the centuries, had prevented the emperor from infringing upon their local liberties. They had taken care to keep the emperorship an elective office, so that with each election, local liberties could be reaffirmed. After 1356, the right of electing an emperor was vested in 7 electors, 4 of the princely lords, the Count Palatine, 89, Duke of Saxony, Margrave of Brandenburg, and King of Bohemia, and 3 of the ecclesiastical lords, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. In 1452, the electors chose the Archduke of Austria to be emperor. His family name was Habsburg. The Habsburgs, by using the resources of their hereditary possessions in Austria and later elsewhere, and by delicately balancing and bribing the numerous political forces within Germany, managed to get themselves consistently reelected to the Holy Roman Emperorship in every generation, with one exception from 1452 until 1806. The Habsburg emperors also tried to introduce the centralizing principles of the new monarchy into an empire that lacked institutions for the exercise of centralized power. The Habsburgs, under Maximilian I, 1493 to 1519, there seemed to be progress in that direction. The empire was divided into administrative circles, and an imperial chamber and council were created, but they were all doomed to failure before the immovable obstacle of regional states' rights. Maximilian was also the author of the Habsburg family fortunes through his strategic use of royal marriages, which brought the Habsburgs into control of a vast empire. Maximilian's grandson, Charles, thus inherited from his four grandparents the lands of Austria, the Netherlands, and part of Burgundy, Castile and Aragon in Spain, the whole of Spanish America, and scattered possessions in Italy and the Mediterranean. In addition, in 1519, Charles was elected Holy Roman Emperor and so became the symbolic head of all Germany. Charles V of the Empire, he was known as Charles I in Spain, was thus beyond all comparison the most powerful ruler of his day. But still other fortunes awaited the House of Habsburg. The Turks, who had occupied Constantinople in 1453, were at this time pushing through Hungary and menacing Central Europe. In 1526, they defeated the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohacs. The parliaments of Hungary and of the adjoining Kingdom of Bohemia, hoping to gain allies in the face of the Turkish threat, thereupon elected Charles Fahd's brother Ferdinand as their king. 19er Ferdinand soon lost much of Hungary to the Turkish Sultan, Suleiman I, but he retained his royal crown and gradually expanded Habsburg influence in Central Europe. No royal family since Charlemagne had stood so far above all rivals. Contemporaries cried that Europe was threatened with universal monarchy, with a kind of imperial system in which no people could preserve its independence from the Habsburgs. Charles V. The reader who wishes to understand the early modern European religious revolution and the spreading support for Protestantism must bear in mind the intricate interplay of the factors that have now been outlined: the declining respect for the Roman Church, the growth of secular and humanistic feeling, the spread of lay religion outside the official clergy, the rise of monarchs who wished to control everything in their kingdoms, including the church, the resistance of feudal elements to these same monarchs, the lassitude of the popes and their fear of church councils, the division of Germany, the Turkish entry into Central Europe, the crusading traditions in Spain, the preeminence of Charles V, and the fears felt in other countries, especially in France, of absorption by the amazing empire of the Habsburgs.